What is even more terrifying than a vicious electrical storm on a treacherous mountain road? Siberian bears. Jules Verne. Today on the Classic Tales podcast. Welcome to the Classic Tales podcast. Thank you for listening. I don't know how you are, but when I'm finishing up a book, I'm always wondering what to listen to next. Will the automated suggestions do it for me? Does the algorithm really understand what I like? With the Audiobook Library Card, you gain access to everything I've personally curated from the public domain and recorded over the past 18 years. Every title was purposely chosen because it was calling to me for some reason. I needed to record it. I got a recent comment on YouTube saying that they could tell that I love every story I record, and it shows. Well, I do. I'm passionate about the classics, and I'm glad it shows. Subscribe for the Audiobook Library Card for $9.99 a month and get access to it all. There's no better way to get friendly with the classics. Go to audiobooklibrarycard.com or follow the link in the show notes and discover the wonders of the classics. And now, Michael Strogoff, Part 4 of 9 by Jules Verne. Chapter 11. Travelers in Distress. During the momentary lull which followed, shouts could be distinctly heard from farther on, at no great distance from the tarantass. It was an earnest appeal, evidently from some traveler in distress. Michael listened attentively. The yemshik also listened, but shook his head, as though it was impossible to help. "They are travelers, calling for aid," cried Nadia. "They can expect nothing," replied the yemshik. "Why not?" cried Michael. "Ought not we do for them what they would for us under similar circumstances?" "Surely you will not risk the carriage and horses." "I will go on foot," replied Michael, interrupting the yemshik. "I will go too, brother," said the young girl. "No, remain here, Nadia. The yemshik will stay with you. I do not wish to leave him alone." "I will stay," replied Nadia. "Whatever happens, do not leave this spot." "You will find me where I now am." Michael pressed her hand, and, turning the corner of the slope, disappeared into the darkness. "Your brother is wrong," said the yemshik. "He is right," replied Nadia simply. Meanwhile, Strogoff strode rapidly on. If he was in a great hurry to aid the travelers, he was also very anxious to know who it was that had not been hindered from starting by the storm, for he had no doubt that the cries came from the telga, which had so long preceded him. The rain had stopped, but the storm was raging with redoubled fury. The shouts, borne on the air, became more distinct. Nothing was to be seen of the pass in which Nadia remained. The road wound along, and the squalls, checked by the corners, formed eddies highly dangerous, to pass which, without being taken off his legs, Michael had to use his utmost strength. He soon perceived that the travelers whose shouts he had heard were at no great distance. Even then, on account of the darkness, Michael could not see them. Yet he heard distinctly their words. This is what he heard, and what caused him some surprise. "Are you coming back, blockhead? You shall have a taste of the knout at the next stage. Did you hear, you devil's postilion? Hello! Below! This is how a carriage takes you in this country. Yes, this is what you call a telga. Oh, that abominable driver. He goes on and does not appear to have discovered that he has left us behind. To deceive me, too. Me, an honourable Englishman. I will make a complaint to the Chancellor's office and have the fellow hanged." This was said in a very angry tone, but was suddenly interrupted by a burst of laughter from his companion, who exclaimed, "Well, this is a good joke, I must say." "You venture to laugh?" said the Briton angrily. "Certainly, my dear confrère, and that most heartily. Upon my word, I never saw anything to come up to it." Just then a crashing clap of thunder re-echoed through the defile, and then died away among the distant peaks. When the sound of the last growl had ceased, the merry voice went on. "Yes, it undoubtedly is a good joke. This machine certainly never came from France." "Nor from England," replied the other. On the road, by the light of the flashes, Michael saw 20 yards from him 2 travelers, seated side by side in a most peculiar vehicle, the wheels of which were deeply embedded in the ruts formed in the road. He approached them, the one grinning from ear to ear, and the other gloomily contemplating his situation, and recognized them as the 2 reporters who had been his companions on board the Caucasus. "Good morning to you, sir," cried the Frenchman. "Delighted to see you here. Let me introduce you to my intimate enemy, Mr. Blount." The English reporter bowed and was about to introduce in turn his companion, Alcide Jolivet, in accordance with the rules of society, when Michael interrupted him. "Perfectly unnecessary, sir. We already know each other, for we travelled together on the Volga." "Ah, yes, exactly so, Mr. "Nicholas Korpanov, merchant of Irkutsk. But may I know what has happened, which, through a misfortune to your companion, amuses you so much?" "Certainly, Mr. Korpanov," replied Alcide. "Fancy! Our driver has gone off with the front part of the confounded carriage. He left us quietly seated in the back part. So here we are in the worst half of Itelga. No driver, no horses. Is it not a joke?" "No joke at all," said the Englishman. "Indeed it is, my dear fellow. You do not know how to look at the bright side of things." "How, pray, are we to go on?" asked Blount. "That is the easiest thing in the world," replied Alcide. "Go and harness yourself to what remains of our cart. I will take the reins and call you my little pigeon, like a true yemshik, and you will trot off like a real post-horse." "Mr. Jolivet," replied the Englishman, "this joking is going too far. It passes all limits, and—" "Now do be quiet, my dear sir. When you are done up, I will take your place, and call me a broken-winded snail and faint-hearted tortoise if I don't take you over the ground at a rattling pace." Alcide said all this with such perfect good humor that Michael could not help smiling. "Gentlemen," said he, "here is a better plan. We have now reached the highest ridge of the Ural chain, and thus have merely to descend the slopes of the mountain. My carriage is close by, only 200 yards behind. I will lend you one of my horses, harness it to the remains of the telga, and tomorrow, if no accident befalls us, we will arrive together at Ekaterinburg." "That, Mr. Korpanov," said Alcide, "is indeed a generous proposal." "Indeed, sir," replied Michael. "I would willingly offer you places in my tarantas, but it will only hold 2, and my sister and I already feel it." "Really, sir," answered Alcide, "with your horse and our demi-telga, we will go to the world's end." "Sir," said Harry Blount, "we most willingly accept your kind offer. And as to that yemshik—" "Oh, I assure you that you are not the first travellers to have met with that similar misfortune," replied Michael. "But why should not our driver come back? He knows perfectly well that he has left us behind, wretch that he is." "He never suspected such a thing."
"What? The fellow not know that he was leaving the better half of his telga behind?"
"Not a bit, and in all good faith is driving the forepart into Ekaterinburg."
"Did I not tell you that it was a good joke, confrère?"
cried Alcide. "Then, gentlemen, if you will follow me," said Michael, "we will return to my carriage and—"
"But the telga,"
observed the Englishman. "There is not the slightest fear that it will fly away, my dear Blount," exclaimed Alcide. "It has taken such good root in the ground that if it were left here until next spring it would begin to bud." "Come then, gentlemen," said Michael Strogoff, "and we will bring up the tarantas." The Frenchman and the Englishman, descending from their seats, no longer the hinder one, since the front had taken its departure, followed Michael. Walking along, Alcide Jolivet chattered away as usual, with his invariable good humor.
"Faith, Mr. Korpanov," said he, "you have indeed got us out of a bad scrape."
"I have only done, sir," replied Michael, "what anyone would have done in my place."
"Well, sir, you have done us a good turn, And if you are going farther, we may possibly meet again, and—"
Alcide Jolivet did not put any direct question to Michael as to where he was going, but the latter, not wishing it to be suspected that he had anything to conceal, at once replied, "I am bound for Omsk, gentlemen."
"Mr. Blount and I," replied Alcide, "go where danger is certainly to be found, and without doubt news also."
"To the invaded provinces?" asked Michael with some earnestness.
"Exactly so, Mr. Kopanoff, and we may possibly meet there."
"Indeed, sir," replied Michael. "I have little love for cannonballs or lance points, and am by nature too great a lover of peace to venture where fighting is going on."
"I am sorry, sir, extremely sorry. We must only regret that we shall separate so soon. But on leaving Ekaterinburg, it may be our fortunate fate to travel together, if only for a few days."
"Do you go on to Omsk?" asked Michael, after a moment's reflection.
"We know nothing as yet," replied Alcide. "But we shall certainly go as far as Ishim, and once there, our movements must depend on circumstances."
"Well then, gentlemen," said Michael, "we will be fellow travelers as far as Ishim." Michael would certainly have preferred to travel alone, but he could not, without appearing at least singular, seek to separate himself from the two reporters, who were taking the same road that he was. Besides, since Alcide and his companion intended to make some stay at Ishim, he thought it rather convenient than otherwise to make that part of the journey in their company. Then, in an indifferent tone, he asked, "Do you know, with any certainty, where this Tartar invasion is?"
"Indeed, sir," replied Alcide. "We only know what they said at Perm. Feofar Khan's Tartars have invaded the whole province from Semipolatinsk, and for some days, by forced marches, have been descending the Irtish. You must hurry if you wish to get to Omsk before them."
"Indeed I must," replied Michael.
"It is reported also that Colonel Ogarev has succeeded in passing the frontier in disguise, and that he will not be slow in joining the Tartar chief in the revolted country."
"But how do they know it?" asked Michael, whom this news, more or less true, so directly concerned.
"Oh, as these things are always known," replied Alcide. "It is in the air."
"Then have you really reason to think that Colonel Ogarev is in Siberia?"
"I myself have heard it said that he was to take the road from Kasan to Ekaterinburg."
"Ah, you know that, Mr. Jolivet?" said Harry Blount, roused from his silence.
"I knew it," replied Alcide. "And do you know that he went disguised as a gypsy?" asked Blount.
"As a gypsy?" exclaimed Michael, almost involuntarily, and he suddenly remembered the look of the old Bohemian at Nizhny Novgorod, his voyage on board the Caucasus, and his disembarking at Kasan.
"Just well enough to make a few remarks on the subject in a letter to my cousin," replied Alcide, smiling. "You lost no time at Kasan," dryly observed the Englishman. "No, my dear fellow. And while the Caucasus was laying in her supply of fuel, I was employed in obtaining a store of information."
Michael no longer listened to the repartee, which Harry Blount and Alcide exchanged. He was thinking of the gypsy troupe, of the old Tsigane, whose face he had not been able to see, and of the strange woman who accompanied him, and then the peculiar glance which she had cast at him. Suddenly, close by, he heard a pistol shot.
"Ah, forward, sirs!" cried he.
"Hello," said Alcide to himself.
"This quiet merchant, who always avoids bullets, is in a great hurry to go where they are flying just about now."
Quickly followed by Harry Blount, who was not a man to be behind in danger, he dashed after Michael. In another instant the three were opposite the projecting rock which protected the tarantass at the turning of the road. The clump of pines struck by the lightning was still burning. There was no one to be seen. However, Michael was not mistaken. Suddenly a dreadful growling was heard, and then another report. "A bear," cried Michael, who could not mistake the growling.
"Nadia! Nadia!"
And drawing his cutlass from his belt, Michael bounded round the buttress behind which the young girl had promised to wait. The pines, completely enveloped in flames, threw a wild glare on the scene. As Michael reached the tarantass, a huge animal retreated towards him. It was a monstrous bear. The tempest had driven it from the woods, and it had come to seek refuge in this cave, doubtless its habitual retreat, which Nadia then occupied. Two of the horses, terrified at the presence of the enormous creature, breaking their traces, had escaped, and the yemshik, thinking only of his beasts, leaving Nadia face to face with the bear, had gone in pursuit of them. But the brave girl had not lost her presence of mind. The animal, which had not at first seen her, was attacking the remaining horse. Nadia, leaving the shelter in which she had been crouching, had run to the carriage, taken one of Michael's revolvers, and advancing resolutely towards the bear, had fired close to it. The animal, slightly wounded in the shoulder, turned on the girl, who rushed for protection behind the tarantas, but then, seeing that the horse was attempting to break its traces, and knowing that if it did so, and the others were not recovered, their journey could not be continued, with the most perfect coolness, she again approached the bear, and, as it raised its paw to strike her down, gave it the contents of the second barrel. It was the report which Michael had just heard. In an instant, he was on the spot. Another bound, and he was between the bear and the girl. His arm made one movement upwards, and the enormous beast, ripped up by that terrible knife, fell to the ground a lifeless mass. He had executed in splendid style the famous blow of the Siberian hunters, who endeavor not to damage the precious fur of the bear, which fetches a high price. "You are not wounded, sister?" said Michael, springing to the side of the young girl. "No, brother," replied Nadia. At that moment the two journalists came up. Alcide seized the horse's head, and in an instant his strong wrist mastered it. His companion and he had seen Michael's rapid stroke. "Bravo!" cried Alcide. "For a simple merchant, Mr. Korpanov, you handled the hunter's knife in a most masterly fashion." "Most masterly indeed," added Blount. "In Siberia," replied Michael, "we are obliged to do a little of everything." Alcide regarded him attentively. Seen in the bright glare, his knife dripping with blood, his tall figure, his foot firm on the huge carcass, he was indeed worth looking at. "A formidable fellow," said Alcide to himself. Then, advancing respectfully, he saluted the young girl. Nadia bowed slightly. Alcide turned towards his companion. "The sister worthy of the brother," said he. "Now, were I a bear, I should not meddle with two so brave and so charming." Harry Blount, perfectly upright, stood hat in hand at some distance. His companion's easy manners only increased his usual stiffness. At that moment the yemshik, who had succeeded in recapturing his two horses, reappeared. He cast a regretful glance at the magnificent animal lying on the ground, loath to leave it to the birds of prey, and then proceeded once more to harness his team. Michael acquainted him with the traveller's situation, and his intention of loaning one of the horses. "As you please," replied the yemshik. "Only, you know, 2 carriages instead of 1. "All right, my friend," said Alcide, who understood the insinuation. "We will pay double." "Then gee up, my turtle doves," cried the yemshik. Nadia again took her place in the tarantas. Michael and his companions followed on foot. It was 3 o'clock. The storm still swept with terrific violence across the defile. When the first streaks of daybreak appeared, the tarantas had reached the telga, which was still conscientiously embedded as far as the center of the wheel. Such being the case, it can be easily understood how a sudden jerk would separate the front from the hinder part. One of the horses was now harnessed by means of cords to the remains of the telga. The reporters took their place on the singular equipage, and the 2 carriages started off. They had now only to descend the Ural slopes, in doing which there was not the slightest difficulty. 6 hours afterwards the 2 vehicles, the tarantas preceding the telga, arrived at Ekaterinburg, nothing worthy of note having happened in the descent. The first person the reporters perceived at the door of the post-house was their yemshik, who appeared to be waiting for them. This worthy Russian had a fine, open countenance, and he smilingly approached the travellers, and, holding out his hand, in a quiet tone he demanded the usual pourboire. This very cool request roused Blount's ire to its highest pitch, and had not the yemshik prudently retreated, a straight-out blow of the fist, in true British boxing style, would have paid his claim of na vodku. Alcide Jolivet, at this burst of anger, laughed as he had never laughed before. "But the poor devil is quite right," he cried. "He is perfectly right, my dear fellow. It is not his fault if we did not know how to follow him." Then, drawing several kopecks from his pocket, "Here, my friend," said he, handing them to the emshik. "Take them. If you have not earned them, that is not your fault." This redoubled Mr. Blount's irritation. He even began to speak of a lawsuit against the owner of the telga. "A lawsuit in Russia, my dear fellow?" cried Alcide. "Things must indeed change should it ever be brought to a conclusion. Did you never hear the story of the wet nurse who claimed payment of 12 months' nursing of some poor little infant?" "I never heard it," replied Harry Blount. "Then you do not know what that suckling had become by the time judgment was given in favor of the nurse?" "What was he, pray?" "Colonel of the Imperial Guard." At this reply all burst into a laugh. Alcide, enchanted with his own joke, drew out his notebook, and in it wrote the following memorandum, destined to figure in a forthcoming French and Russian dictionary. Telga, a Russian carriage with 4 wheels, that is, when it starts, 2 wheels when it arrives at its destination. Chapter 12. Provocation. Ekaterinburg, geographically, is an Asiatic city, for it is situated beyond the Ural Mountains, on the farthest eastern slopes of the chain. Nevertheless, it belongs to the government of Perm, and consequently is included in one of the great divisions of European Russia. It is as though a morsel of Siberia lay in Russian jaws. Neither Michael nor his companions were likely to experience the slightest difficulty in obtaining means of continuing their journey in so large a town as Ekaterinburg. It was founded in 1723, and has since become a place of considerable size, for in it is the chief mint of the empire. There also are the headquarters of the officials employed in the management of the mines. Thus the town is the center of an important district, abounding in manufactories, principally for the working and refining of gold and platina. Just now, the population of Ekaterinburg had greatly increased, many Russians and Siberians, menaced by the Tartar invasion, having collected there. Thus, though it had been so troublesome a matter to find horses and vehicles when going to Ekaterinburg, there was no difficulty in leaving it, for under present circumstances, few travelers cared to venture on the Siberian roads. So it happened that Blount and Alcide had not the slightest trouble in replacing, by a sound telga, the famous demi-carriage which had managed to take them to Ekaterinburg. As to Michael, he retained his tarantas, which was not much the worse for its journey across the Urals, and he had only to harness 3 good horses to it to take him swiftly over the road to Irkutsk. As far as Tyoman, and even up to Novozaimsko, this road has slight inclines, which gentle undulations are the first signs of the slopes of the Ural Mountains. But after Novozaimsko begins the immense steppe. At Ichim, as we have said, the reporters intended to stop. That is about 420 miles from Ekaterinburg. There they intended to be guided by circumstances as to their route across the invaded country, either together or separately, according as their news-hunting instinct set them on one track or another. This road from Ekaterinburg to Ichim, which passes through Irkutsk, was the only one which Michael could take. But as he did not run after news, and wished on the contrary to avoid the country devastated by the invaders, he determined to stop nowhere. "I am very happy to make part of my journey in your company," said he to his new companions. "But I must tell you that I am most anxious to reach Omsk, for my sister and I are going to rejoin our mother. Who can say whether we shall arrive before the Tartars reach the town? I must therefore stop at the post-houses only long enough to change horses, and must travel day and night." "That is exactly what we intend doing," replied Blount. "Good," replied Michael. "But do not lose an instant. Buy or hire a carriage whose hind wheels," added Alcide, "are warranted to arrive at the same time as its front wheels." Half an hour afterwards, the energetic Frenchman had found a tarantas, in which he and his companion at once seated themselves. Michael and Nadia once more entered their own carriage, and at 12 o'clock The two vehicles left the town of Ekaterinburg together. Nadia was at last in Siberia, on that long road which led to Irkutsk. What must then have been the thoughts of the young girl? 3 strong, swift horses were taking her across that land of exile where her parent was condemned to live. For how long she knew not, and so far from his native land. But she scarcely noticed those long steps over which the tarantass was rolling, and which at one time she had despaired of ever seeing. For her eyes were gazing at the horizon, beyond which she knew her banished father was. She saw nothing of the country across which she was traveling at the rate of 15 versts an hour, nothing of those regions of western Siberia, so different from those of the east. Here, indeed, were few cultivated fields. The soil was poor, at least at the surface, but in its bowels lay hid quantities of iron, copper, platina, and gold. How can hands be found to cultivate the land when it pays better to burrow beneath the earth? The pickaxe is everywhere at work, the spade nowhere. However, Nadia's thoughts sometimes left the provinces of Lake Baikal and returned to her present situation. Her father's image faded away and was replaced by that of her generous companion as he first appeared on the Vladimir Railroad. She recalled his attentions during that journey, his arrival at the police station, the hearty simplicity with which he had called her sister, his kindness to her in the descent of the Volga, and then all that he did for her on that terrible night in the storm in the Urals, when he saved her life at the peril of his own. Thus Nadia thought of Michael. She thanked God for having given her such a gallant protector, a friend so generous and wise. She knew that she was safe with him, under his protection. No brother could have done more than he. All obstacles seemed cleared away. The performance of her journey was but a matter of time. Michael remained buried in thought. He also thanked God for having brought about this meeting with Nadia, which at the same time enabled him to do a good action and afforded him additional means for concealing his true character. He delighted in the young girl's calm intrepidity. Was she not indeed his sister? His feeling towards his beautiful and brave companion was rather respect than affection. He felt that hers was one of those pure and rare hearts which are held by all in high esteem. However, Michael's dangers were now beginning, since he had reached Siberian ground. If the reporters were not mistaken, if Ivan Ogarev had really passed the frontier, all his actions must be made with extreme caution. Things were now altered. Tartar spies swarmed in the Siberian provinces. His incognito once discovered, his character as courier of the Tsar known, there was an end of his journey, and probably of his life. Michael felt now more than ever the weight of his responsibility. While such were the thoughts of those accompanying the first carriage, what was happening in the second? Nothing out of the way. Alcide spoke in sentences. Blount replied by monosyllables. Each looked at everything in his own light, and made notes of such incidents as occurred on the journey, few and but slightly varied, while they crossed the provinces of western Siberia. At each relay the reporters descended from their carriage and found themselves with Michael. Except when meals were to be taken at the post-houses, Nadia did not leave the tarantass. When obliged to breakfast or dine, she sat at table, but was always very reserved and seldom joined in conversation. Alcide, without going beyond the limits of strict propriety, showed that he was greatly struck by the young girl. He admired the silent energy which she showed in bearing all the fatigues of so difficult a journey. The forced stoppages were anything but agreeable to Michael, so he hastened the departure at each relay, roused the innkeepers, urged on the iamshiks, and expedited the harnessing of the tarantass. Then, the hurried meal over, always much too hurried to agree with Blount, who was a methodical eater, they started, and were driven as eagles, for they paid like princes. It need scarcely be said that Blount did not trouble himself about the girl at table. That gentleman was not in the habit of doing two things at once. She was also one of the few subjects of conversation which he did not care to discuss with his companion. Alcide having asked him on one occasion how old he thought the girl. "What girl?" he replied, quite seriously. "Why,
Nicholas Kopanov's sister."
"Is she his sister?"
"No, his grandmother," replied Alcide, angry at his indifference. "What age should you consider her?"
"Had I been present at her birth, I might have known."
Very few of the Siberian peasants were to be seen in the fields. The peasants are remarkable for their pale, grave faces, which a celebrated traveler has compared to those of the Castilians, without the haughtiness of the latter. Here and there some villages already deserted indicated the approaching of the Tartar hordes. The inhabitants, having driven off their flocks of sheep, their camels, and their horses, were taking refuge in the plains of the north. Some tribes of the wandering Kirghiz, who remained faithful, had transported their tents beyond the Irtych to escape the depredations of the invaders. Happily, post-traveling was as yet uninterrupted, and telegraphic communication could still be effected between places connected with the wire. At each relay, horses were to be had on the usual conditions. At each telegraphic station, the clerks transmitted messages delivered to them, delaying for state dispatches alone. Thus far, then, Michael's journey had been accomplished satisfactorily. The courier of the Tsar had in no way been impeded. And if he could only get on to Krasnoyarsk, which seemed the farthest point attained by Feofar Khan's Tartars, he knew that he could arrive at Irkutsk before them. The day after the two carriages had left Ekaterinburg, they reached the small town of Tulugisk at 7 o'clock in the morning, having covered 220 versts, no event worthy of mention having occurred. The same evening, the 22nd of July, they arrived at Tyomen. Tyomen, whose population is usually 10,000 inhabitants, then contained double that number. This, the first industrial town established by the Russians in Siberia, in which may be seen a fine metal refining factory and a bell foundry, had never before presented such an animated appearance. The correspondents immediately went off after news. That, brought by Siberian fugitives from the seat of war, was far from reassuring. They said, amongst other things, that Feofar Khan's army was rapidly approaching the valley of the Ichim, and they confirmed the report that the Tartar chief was soon to be joined by Colonel Ogarev, if he had not been so already. Hence the conclusion that the operations would be pushed in eastern Siberia with the greatest activity. However, the loyal Cossacks of the government of Tobolsk were advancing by forced marches towards Tomsk in the hope of cutting off the Tartar columns. At midnight, the town of Novosemsk was reached, and the travelers now left behind them the country broken by tree-covered hills, the last remains of the Urals. Here began the regular Siberian steppe, which extends to the neighborhood of Krasnoyarsk. It is a boundless plain, a vast, grassy desert. Earth and sky here form a circle as distinct as that traced by a sweep of the compasses. The steppe presents nothing to attract notice but the long line of the telegraph posts, their wires vibrating in the breeze like the strings of a harp. The road could be distinguished from the rest of the plain only by the clouds of fine dust which rose under the wheels of the tarantas. Had it not been for this white riband, which stretched away as far as the eye could reach, the travelers might have thought themselves in a desert. Michael and his companions again pressed rapidly forward. The horses, urged on by the yamshik, seemed to fly over the ground, for there was not the slightest obstacle to impede them. The tarantas was going straight for Ichim, where the two correspondents intended to stop, if nothing happened to make them alter their plans. 120 miles separated Novosemsk from the town of Ichim, and before 8 o'clock the next evening, the distance could and should be accomplished if no time was lost. In the opinion of the yamshiks, should the travelers not be great lords or high functionaries, they were worthy of being so, if it was only for their generosity in the matter of navodku. On the afternoon of the next day, the 23rd of July, the two carriages were not more than 30 versts from Ichim. Suddenly Michael caught sight of a carriage, scarcely visible among the clouds of dust, preceding them along the road. As his horses were evidently less fatigued than those of the other traveler, he would not be long in overtaking it. There was neither a tarantas nor a telga, but a post-berlin, which looked as if it had made a long journey. The postilion was thrashing his horses with all his might,
and only kept them at a gallop by dint of abuse and blows. The Berlin had certainly not passed through Novosemsk, and could only have struck the Irkutsk road by some less frequented route across the steppe. Our travelers' first thought, on seeing this Berlin, was to get in front of it and arrive first at the relay, so as to make sure of fresh horses. They said a word to their iamshiks, who soon brought them up with the Berlin. Michael Strogoff came up first. As he passed, a head was thrust out of the window of the Berlin. He had not time to see what it was like, but as he dashed by, he distinctly heard this word, uttered in an imperious tone, "Stop!" But they did not stop. On the contrary, the Berlin was soon distanced by the two tarantuses. It now became a regular race, for the horses of the Berlin, no doubt excited by the sight and pace of the others, recovered their strength and kept up for some minutes. The three carriages were hidden in a cloud of dust. From this cloud issued the cracking whips mingled with excited shouts and exclamations of anger. Nevertheless, the advantage remained with Michael and his companions, which might be very important to them if the relay was poorly provided with horses. 2 carriages were perhaps more than the postmaster could provide for, at least in a short space of time. Half an hour after, the Berlin was left far behind, looking only a speck on the horizon of the steppe. It was 8 o'clock in the evening when the 2 carriages reached Ichim. The news was worse and worse with regard to the invasion. The town itself was menaced by the Tartar vanguard, and 2 days before, the authorities had been obliged to retreat to Tobolsk. There was not an officer nor a soldier left at Ichim. On arriving at the relay, Michael Strogoff immediately asked for horses. He had been fortunate in distancing the Berlin. Only 3 horses were fit to be harnessed. The others had just come in worn out from a long stage. As the 2 correspondents intended to stop at Ichim, they had not to trouble themselves to find transport, and had their carriage put away. In 10 minutes Michael was told that his tarantus was ready to start. "Good," said he. Then turning to the 2 reporters, "Well, gentlemen, the time has come for us to separate." "What, Mr. Korpanov?" said Alcide Jolivet. "Shall you not stop even for an hour at Ichim?" "No, sir. I am also wish to leave the post-house before the arrival of the Berlin which we distanced." "Are you afraid that the traveler will dispute the horses with you?" "I particularly wish to avoid any difficulty." "Then, Mr. Korpanov," said Jolivet, "it only remains for us to thank you once more for the service you rendered us, and the pleasure we have had in traveling with you." "It is possible that we shall meet you again in a few days at Omsk," added Blount. "It is possible," answered Michael, "since I am going straight there." "Well, I wish you a safe journey, Mr. Korpanov," said Alcide, "and heaven preserve you from Telgas." The 2 reporters held out their hands to Michael, with the intention of cordially shaking his, when the sound of a carriage was heard outside. Almost immediately the door was flung open and a man appeared. It was the traveler of the Berlin, a military-looking man, apparently about 40 years of age, tall, robust in figure, broad-shouldered, with a strongly set head and thick mustaches meeting red whiskers. He wore a plain uniform. A cavalry saber hung at his side, and in his hand he held a short-handled whip. "Horses!" he demanded, with the air of a man accustomed to command. "I have no more disposable horses," answered the postmaster, bowing. "I must have some this moment." "It is impossible." "What are those horses which have just been harnessed to the tarantus I saw at the door?" "They belong to this traveler," answered the postmaster, pointing to Michael Strogoff. "Take them out," said the traveler, in a tone which admitted of no reply. Michael then advanced. "These horses are engaged by me," he said. "What does that matter? I must have them. Come, be quick. I have no time to lose." "I have no time to lose either," replied Michael, restraining himself with difficulty. Nadia was near him, calm also, but secretly uneasy at a scene which it would have been better to avoid. "Enough," said the traveler. Then going up to the postmaster, "Let the horses be put into my berlin," he exclaimed with a threatening gesture. The postmaster, much embarrassed, did not know whom to obey, and looked at Michael, who evidently had the right to resist the unjust demands of the traveler. Michael hesitated an instant. He did not wish to make use of his podorojna, which would have drawn attention to him, and he was most unwilling also, by giving up his horses, to delay his journey, and yet he must not engage in a struggle which might compromise his mission. The two reporters looked at him, ready to support him, should he appeal to them. "My horses will remain in my carriage," said Michael, but without raising his tone more than would be suitable for a plain Irkutsk merchant. The traveler advanced towards Michael and laid his hand heavily on his shoulder. "Is that so?" he said roughly. "You will not give up your horses to me?" "No," answered Michael. "Very well. They shall belong to whichever of us is able to start. Defend yourself. I shall not spare you." So saying, the traveler drew his saber from its sheath, and Nadia threw herself before Michael. Blount and Alcide Jolivet advanced towards him. "I shall not fight," said Michael quietly, folding his arms across his chest. "You will not fight?" "No." "Not even after this?" exclaimed the traveler, and before anyone could prevent him, he struck Michael's shoulder with the handle of the whip. At this insult, Michael turned deadly pale. His hands moved convulsively, as if he would have knocked the brute down, but by a tremendous effort he mastered himself. A duel. It was more than a delay. It was perhaps the failure of his mission. It would be better to lose some hours. Yes, but to swallow this affront. "Will you fight now, coward?" repeated the traveler, adding coarseness to brutality. "No," answered Michael, without moving, but looking the other straight in the face. "The horses, this moment," said the man, and left the room. The postmaster followed him, after shrugging his shoulders and bestowing on Michael a glance of anything but approbation. The effect produced on the reporters by this incident was not to Michael's advantage. Their discomfiture was visible. How could this strong young man allow himself to be struck like that and not demand satisfaction for such an insult? They contented themselves with bowing to him and retired, Jolivet remarking to Harry Blount, "I could not have believed that of a man who is so skillful in finishing up Ural Mountain bears. Is it the case that a man can be courageous at one time and a coward at another? It is quite incomprehensible." A moment afterwards, the noise of wheels and whip showed that the Berlin, drawn by the Tarantus horses, was driving rapidly away from the post-house. Nadia, unmoved, and Michael, still quivering, remained alone in the room. The courier of the Tsar, his arms crossed over his chest, was seated motionless as a statue. A color, which could not have been the blush of shame, had replaced the paleness on his countenance. Nadia did not doubt that powerful reasons alone could have allowed him to suffer so great a humiliation from such a man. Going up to him as he had come to her in the police station at Nizhny Novgorod, "Your hand, brother," said she, and at the same time her hand, with an almost maternal gesture, wiped away a tear which sprang to her companion's eye. Chapter 13. Duty Before Everything. Nadia, with the clear perception of a right-minded woman, guessed that some secret motive directed all Michael Strogoff's actions, that he, for a reason unknown to her, did not belong to himself, and that in this instance especially, he had heroically sacrificed to duty even his resentment at the gross injury he had received. Nadia, therefore, asked no explanation from Michael. Had not the hand which she had extended to him already replied to all that he might have been able to tell her? Michael remained silent all the evening. The postmaster not being able to supply them with fresh horses until the next morning, the whole night must be passed at the house. Nadia could profit by it to take some rest, and a room was therefore prepared for her. The young girl would no doubt have preferred not to leave her companion, but she felt that he would rather be alone, and she made ready to go to her room. Just as she was about to retire, she could not refrain from going up to Michael to say good night. "Brother," she whispered, but he checked her with a gesture. The girl sighed and left the room. Michael Strogoff did not lie down. He could not have slept for even an hour. The place on which he had been struck by the brutal traveler felt like a burn. "For my country and the Father," he muttered as he ended his evening prayer. He especially felt a great wish to know who was the man who had struck him, whence he came, and where he was going. As to his face, the features of it were so deeply engraven on his memory that he had no fear of ever forgetting them. Michael Strogoff at last asked for the postmaster. The latter, a Siberian of the old type, came directly, and looking rather contemptuously at the young man, waited to be questioned. "You belong to the country?" asked Michael. "Yes." "Do you know that man who took my horse?" "No." "Had you ever seen him before?" "Never." "Who do you think he was?" "A man who knows how to make himself obeyed." Michael fixed his piercing gaze upon the Siberian, but the other did not quail before it. "Do you dare to judge me?" exclaimed Michael. "Yes," answered the Siberian. "There are some things even a plain merchant cannot receive without returning." "Blows?" "Blows, young man. I am of an age and strength to tell you so." Michael went up to the postmaster and laid his two powerful hands on his shoulders. Then, in a peculiarly calm tone, "Be off, my friend," said he. "Be off. I could kill you." The postmaster understood. "I like him better for that," he muttered, and retired without another word. At 8 o'clock the next morning, the 24th of July, 3 strong horses were harnessed to the tarantass. Michael Strogoff and Nadia took their places, and Ichim, with its disagreeable remembrances, was soon left far behind. At the different relays at which they stopped during the day, Strogoff ascertained that the Berlin still preceded them on the road to Irkutsk, and that the traveler, as hurried as they were, never lost a minute in pursuing his way across the steppe. At 4 o'clock in the evening they reached Abatskaya, 50 miles farther on, where the Ichim, one of the principal affluents of the Irtych, had to be crossed. This passage was rather more difficult than that of the Tobol. Indeed, the current of the Ichim was very rapid at that place. During the Siberian winter, the rivers being all frozen to a thickness of several feet, they are easily practicable, and the traveler even crosses them without being aware of the fact, for their beds have disappeared under the snowy sheet spread uniformly over the steppe. But in summer the difficulties of crossing are sometimes great. In fact, 2 hours were taken up in making the passage of the Ichim, which much exasperated Michael, especially as the boatmen gave them alarming news of the Tartar invasion. Some of Feofor Khan's scouts had already appeared on both banks of the lower Ichim, in the southern parts of the government of Tobolsk. Omsk was threatened. They spoke of an engagement which had taken place between the Siberian and Tartar troops on the frontier of the great Kirghiz horde, an engagement not to the advantage of the Russians, who were weak in numbers. The troops had retreated thence, and in consequence there had been a general emigration of all the peasants of the province. The boatmen spoke of horrible atrocities committed by the invaders: pillage, theft, incendiarism, murder. Such was the system of Tartar warfare. The people all fled before Feofor Khan. Michael Strogoff's great fear was lest, in the depopulation of the towns, he should be unable to obtain the means of transport. He was therefore extremely anxious to reach Omsk. Perhaps there they would get the start of the Tartar scouts, who were coming down the valley of the Irtych, and would find the road open to Irkutsk. Just at the place where the tarantass crossed the river ended what is called, in military language, the Ichim chain, a chain of towers, or little wooden forts, extending from the southern frontier of Siberia for a distance of nearly 400 versts. Formerly these forts were occupied by detachments of Cossacks, and they protected the country against the Kirghiz, as well as against the Tartars. But since the Muscovite government had believed these hordes reduced to absolute submission, they had been abandoned, and now could not be used, just at the time when they were needed. Many of these forts had been reduced to ashes, and the boatman even pointed out the smoke to Michael, rising in the southern horizon, and showing the approach of the Tartar advance guard. As soon as the ferry boat landed the Tarantas on the right bank of the Ichim, the journey across the steppe was resumed with all speed. Michael Strogoff remained very silent. He was, however, always attentive to Nadia, helping her to bear the fatigue of this long journey without break or rest. But the girl never complained. She longed to give wings to the horses. Something told her that her companion was even more anxious than herself to reach Irkutsk, and how many versts were still between. It also occurred to her that if Omsk was entered by the Tartars, Michael's mother, who lived there, would be in danger, and that this was sufficient to explain her son's impatience to get to her. Nadia at last spoke to him of old Marfa, and of how unprotected she would be in the midst of all these events. "Have you received any news of your mother since the beginning of the invasion?" she asked.
"None, Nadia. The last letter my mother wrote to me contained good news. Marfa is a brave and energetic Siberian woman. Notwithstanding her age, she has preserved all her moral strength. She knows how to suffer."
"I shall see her, brother," said Nadia quickly. "Since you give me the name of sister, I am Marfa's daughter." And as Michael did not answer, she added, "Perhaps your mother has been allowed to leave Omsk?"
"It is possible, Nadia," replied Michael, "and I hope she may have reached Tobolsk. Marfa hates the Tartars. She knows the steppe, and would have no fear in just taking her staff and going down the banks of the Irtych. There is not a spot in all the province unknown to her. Many times she has travelled all over the country with my father, and many times I myself, when a mere child, have accompanied them across the Siberian desert. Yes, Nadia, I trust that my mother has left Omsk."
"And when shall you see her?"
"I shall see her on my return."
"If, however, your mother is still at Omsk, you will be able to spare an hour to go to her?"
"I shall not go and see her."
"You will not see her?"
"No, Nadia," said Michael, his chest heaving as he felt he could not go on replying to the girl's questions.
"You say no? Why, brother, if your mother is still at Omsk, for what reason could you refuse to see her?"
"For what reason, Nadia? You ask me for what reason?" exclaimed Michael, in so changed a voice that the young girl started. "For the same reason as that which made me patient, even to cowardice with the villain who—" He could not finish his sentence.
"Calm yourself, brother," said Nadia in a gentle voice. "I only know one thing, or rather, I do not know it, I feel it. It is that all your conduct is now directed by the sentiment of a duty more sacred, if there can be one, than that which unites the son to the mother."
Nadia was silent, and from that moment avoided every subject which in any way touched on Michael's peculiar situation. He had a secret motive, which she must respect. She respected it. The next day, July 25th, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the Tarantas arrived at Chokalmsk, having accomplished a distance of 80 miles since it had crossed the Ichim. They rapidly changed horses. Here, however, for the first time, the yemshik made difficulties about starting, declaring that detachments of Tartars were roving across the steppe, and that travelers, horses, and carriages would be a fine prize for them. Only by dint of a large bribe could Michael get over the unwillingness of the yemshik, for in this instance, as in many others, he did not wish to show his podorojna. The last ukase, having been transmitted by telegraph, was known in the Siberian provinces, and a Russian specially exempted from obeying these words would certainly have drawn public attention to himself, a thing above all to be avoided by the Tsar's courier. As to the yemshik's hesitation, either the rascal traded on the traveler's impatience, or he really had good reason to fear. However, at last the Tarantas started, and made such good way that by 3 in the afternoon it had reached Kolatinsko, 50 miles farther on. An hour after this it was on the banks of the Irtych. Omsk was now only 14 miles distant. The Irtych is a large river, and one of the principal of those which flow towards the north of Asia. Rising in the Altai Mountains, it flows from the southeast to the northwest and empties itself into the Obi, after a course of 4,000 miles. At this time of year,
When all the rivers of the Siberian basin are much swollen, the waters of the Irtych were very high. In consequence, the current was changed to a regular torrent, rendering the passage difficult enough. A swimmer could not have crossed, however powerful, and even in a ferry boat there would be some danger. But Michael and Nadia, determined to brave all perils whatever they might be, did not dream of shrinking from this one. Michael proposed to his young companion that he should cross first, embarking in the ferry boat with the tarantas and horses, as he feared that the weight of this load would render it less safe. After landing the carriage, he would return and fetch Nadia. The girl refused. It would be the delay of an hour, and she would not, for her safety alone, be the cause of it. The embarkation was made not without difficulty, for the banks were partly flooded, and the boat could not get in near enough. However, after half an hour's exertion, the boatman got the tarantas and the 3 horses on board. The passengers embarked also, and they shoved off. For a few minutes, all went well. A little way up the river, the current was broken by a long point projecting from the bank, and forming an eddy easily crossed by the boat. The 2 boatmen propelled their barge with long poles, which they handled cleverly. But as they gained the middle of the stream, it grew deeper and deeper, until at last they could only just reach the bottom. The ends of the poles were only a foot above the water, which rendered their use difficult. Michael and Nadia, seated in the stern of the boat, and always in dread of a delay, watched the boatman with some uneasiness. "Look out!" cried one of them to his comrade. The shout was occasioned by a new direction the boat was rapidly taking. It had got into the direct current and was being swept down the river. By diligent use of the poles, putting the ends in a series of notches cut below the gunwale, the boatman managed to keep the craft against the stream, and slowly urged it in a slanting direction towards the right bank. They calculated on reaching it some 5 or 6 versts below the landing place. But after all, it would not matter so long as men and beasts could disembark without accident. The 2 stout boatmen, stimulated moreover by the promise of double fare, did not doubt of succeeding in this difficult passage of the Irtych. But they reckoned without an accident which they were more powerless to prevent, and neither their zeal nor their skillfulness could, under the circumstances, have done more. The boat was in the middle of the current, at nearly equal distances from either shore, and being carried down at the rate of 2 versts an hour, when Michael, springing to his feet, bent his gaze up the river. Several boats, aided by oars as well as by the current, were coming swiftly down upon them. Michael's brow contracted, and a cry escaped him. "What is the matter?" asked the girl. But before Michael had time to reply, one of the boatmen exclaimed in an accent of terror, "The Tartars! The Tartars!" There were indeed boats full of soldiers, and in a few minutes they must reach the ferry boat, it being too heavily laden to escape from them. The terrified boatmen uttered exclamations of despair and dropped their poles. "Courage, my friends!" cried Michael. "Courage! 50 rubles for you if we reach the right bank before the boats overtake us." Incited by these words, the boatmen again worked manfully, but it soon became evident that they could not escape the Tartars. It was scarcely probable that they would pass without attacking them. On the contrary, there was everything to be feared from robbers such as these. "Do not be afraid, Nadia," said Michael, "but be ready for anything." "I am ready," replied Nadia. "Even to leap into the water when I tell you?" "Whenever you tell me." "Have confidence in me, Nadia." "I have indeed." The Tartar boats were now only 100 feet distant. They carried a detachment of Bokharian soldiers on their way to reconnoiter around Omsk. The ferry boat was still 2 lengths from the shore. The boatmen redoubled their efforts. Michael himself seized a pole and wielded it with superhuman strength. If he could land the tarantas and the horses and dash off with them, there was some chance of escaping the Tartars, who were not mounted. But all their efforts were in vain. "Saridnakichu!" shouted the soldiers from the first boat. Michael recognized the Tartar war cry, which is usually answered by laying flat on the ground. As neither he nor the boatman obeyed, a volley was let fly, and 2 of the horses were mortally wounded. At the next moment, a violent blow was felt. The boats had run into the ferry boat. "Come, Nadia!" cried Michael, ready to jump overboard. The girl was about to follow him when a blow from a lance struck him, and he was thrown into the water. The current swept him away. his hand raised for an instant above the waves, and then he disappeared. Nadia uttered a cry, but before she had time to throw herself after him, she was seized and dragged into one of the boats. The boatmen were killed, the ferry boat left to drift away, and the Tartars continued to descend the Irtych. This is B.J. Harrison. I hope you've enjoyed this unabridged production of Michael Strogoff, Part 4 of 9 by Jules Verne. If you enjoyed this book, you might also enjoy 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, also by Jules Verne. If you have the Audiobook Library Card, you can listen to it now. Go to audiobooklibrarycard.com, subscribe for a monthly subscription, and you're off to the races. Thank you for joining me today and allowing classic literature to awaken your better self. Please join me next time, and we'll rediscover the greatest stories ever put to paper.